Right, so the next panel is on building resilient, healthy habitats and landscapes together during these changing climate conditions. And I think we heard a lot yesterday, so we're building on the discussions yesterday where we talked about that, healthy landscapes, healthy forests are going to make more resilient communities. So I think as we move forward, I want to get right into the speakers. And our first speaker is Clayton Lenk. He's with the National Wild Turkey Federation. He's the district biologist for them in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And he previously worked with the Crow Wings Soil and Water Conservation District, so he has experience with the conservation districts. And he's going to be presenting on how conservation districts in Minnesota use water resources to manage private woodlands. So Clayton, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Let's see if I can get this to work here. All right, how's that coming up for you guys?
Looks good.
Okay. So like I said, my name is Clayton Lenk, and I'll be talking a little bit today about some of the work that we did with the Crow Wings Soil and Water Conservation District, and kind of mainly how we used water resources and kind of water resource planning to achieve management on private woodlands in our area. As Denise said, I'm the district biologist for the National Wild Turkey Federation, kind of in the upper Midwest here. Basically, I administer all of our conservation work in those 4 states on public lands. We do have some private lands folks that are housed with NRCS offices, much like Farm Bill biologists, scattered throughout those states. But my main focus is on public land, so kind of the opposite side of the coin from when I worked for the conservation district. But the mission of the NWTF is dedicated to the conservation of the wild turkey and the preservation of our hunting heritage. Obviously, a lot of the wild turkey conservation and management has to deal with woodland management and habitat management. So that's kind of one of the main key factors here. But formerly, I worked for the Crow Wings Soil and Water Conservation District as our district forester. I was the lead on all of our forestry grants and BMPs, but I also did shoreline and stormwater projects along with some other things. But the SWCD's mission was a bit longer, so to kind of condense it, working with private landowners to accomplish conservation goals, providing technical assistance and financial assistance to protect land and water resources. So these are kind of the things I'll be talking about. There's so many different layers to kind of this whole topic of what we kind of accomplished and kind of the backstory behind it. So it'll be a really probably a 30,000 foot view of everything that's taking place. So I feel like I've left a lot of things out. So if things don't make sense, be sure to contact me and I can fill you in with more details later if you need. But talking about the Camp Ripley A-Cup program, kind of how that ties to water quality and how our LCCMAR grant ties to both of those, a lot of the partnerships involved. And then I'll touch a little bit about NWTF and then kind of wrap things up. So a little bit of background for folks who don't know where the Crow Wing SWCD is or where Camp Ripley is. We're very centrally located in Minnesota in Crow Wing County. Here we're in the southwestern part of the county is Brainerd. Many folks have been to Brainerd or heard of Mille Lacs Lake, which is about 20 miles to the east. Very popular destination area in Minnesota. Lots of lakes, lots of cabins. It seems like our population doubles or even triples between Memorial Day and Labor Day, just for all the folks that come up. So, and the majority of the county and a lot of the area really is sandier soils, lots of oaks, jack pines, all those types of kind of fire dependent species. Kind of excluding the southeast corner there turns more into heavier soils. But this is just a snippet from Google Maps kind of showing why we're called the lakes area. I think there's over 400 lakes in Crow Wing County alone. So it's a pretty hot spot. Camp Ripley is kind of what our grant and our work has been focused around. As you can see, it kind of touches Crow Wing County there and several other counties, Morrison County, Cass County. So this is kind of where our focus is. It's a 53,000 acre installation that's used to train, you know, the National Guard, Army, Marines. It's used to train all the branches of the armed forces. It's also used to train other entities like our Minnesota Department of Transportation. Their snowplows train there. The Highway Patrol does training there. The conservation officers train there. So it's kind of home to a lot of different training. And kind of the issue that they were starting to run into or feared for the future was developmental pressure. You know, since this is such a hot spot, a recreational area, there's a lot of people building cabins, a lot of people moving up here, especially this last year with COVID and all the stuff going on in the Twin Cities. We've seen a big jump in people moving up here. So kind of the concerns were developmental pressure around the base. You start getting more housing developments. You start getting more complaints about the smoke and the noise and the dust and everything like that that's associated with training. It is a base where they use tanks and do helicopter training and airplane stuff. So it's, you know, they're operating all times a day. So, you know, to kind of cut back on that complaint from all those different types of trainings they do, they kind of started this ACUP program, which I'll talk about next. But you know, if they start getting too many complaints and they start getting restrictions on, you know, what types of training they can do or what time of day they can train. So really for the base to be able to train, you know, at its fullest capacity, it needs to limit the amount of developmental pressure that surrounds that base. So as you can see here in this map, you can see Camp Ripley. That red line is a 3-mile buffer around the camp. That's where this Army compatible use buffer priority focus is. It's a voluntary program that deals primarily with acquisition and conservation easements, but it's ideal for working land. So it's a little bit different than our historical conservation easements because it applies to more than just forested land or rural vacant land. You can also, you know, enroll working lands. So it appeals a lot more to the landowners that are surrounding that base. As you can see in that little map there, the dark red are projects that are already completed. The pink or the light red is projects or landowners that are interested and they just don't have the funding to do that yet. That's how hot of a program it's been. Is there's, you know, the waiting list is just about as long as the number of people that have already gotten through. The map is a little outdated. It's from 2019, but the numbers on the left are as of a couple weeks ago. So, you know, they've protected 53,000 acres so far. So roughly the size of Camp Ripley has already been buffered around camp. 317 land deals, like I said, that's either acquisitions or easements, are completed or ongoing. 295 of those are completed. So there's only 22 that are ongoing right now. And 287 people are on the waiting list. So you can see, you know, just looking at that 3-mile buffer, it's a pretty hot program for folks that surround that area. And kind of tying, you know, bridging that gap between our conservation district and Camp Ripley and the ACUP program are these landscape stewardship plans. There was one written particularly for the Camp Ripley landscape to help us better understand and have a better cohesive management strategy. And it's used by all sorts of different folks. It's used by the federal people, the state, the local, even private consultants use this to write recommendations and have a better strategy for doing management on the landscape. This particular stewardship plan covers 7 different subwatersheds, just under 720,000 acres total. 7 of those subwatersheds, you know, straddle 40 miles of the Mississippi River through there. One of the big focuses for Minnesota is drinking water, and in the Twin Cities, a lot of their drinking water comes from the Mississippi River. So a lot of effort is put into properly managing for water quality, you know, from the headwaters down to the Twin Cities, primarily in that first 400 miles of river there. So, and 206,000 acres of that is private forest. So over a quarter of that is owned by private individuals. This is a kind of a snippet of how we determined which parcels. We talked yesterday with Dan about the rack scoring and how kind of parcels I prioritized and targeted within watersheds. This map is kind of similar, except for this is a map that I would give to a landowner outlining their property. And as you can see in the map, it shows the parcels that are under 20 acres. It shows where conservation easement are, public lands, Camp Ripley, you know, all sorts of different kind of protection levels. And that's where the thermometer on the right comes in handy. You can see where it's at right now is currently 40% protected, and that's public waters, public lands, wetlands, you know, covered under the Wetland Conservation Act, conservation easements, also SFIA, which I'll touch a little bit more on in the next slide, as well as the 2C, which you can see is not in the protected thermometer. But the goal for this watershed is protect to 60%, which if you look at the thermometer, it shows that this particular watershed has a potential to go up to about 86 or 87% protected. So it has definitely the potential to reach its goal in trying to utilize programs like SFIA or conservation easements or that ACUB program to get it past that watershed protection goal is crucial. So SFIA, I'll talk about that a little bit more. It's the Sustainable Forest Incentive Act. It's a Minnesota program. It's similar to a conservation easement, except for it's not perpetual. It's either an 8, 20, or 50-year covenant. And it pays the landowner per acre enrolled during the length of their contract. So it's deemed a little bit of a longer term program, which is why it kind of falls underneath that protection. You know, protection can have a lot of different meanings. So that little bit longer term resource protection, this program definitely fits that. And as you can see from the left map to the right map there, that just including those SFIA acres on the landscape already changes the percent protected in those watersheds fairly significantly. So, you know, that's just SFIA. That's, you know, not including other things. You know, people might have land that they're managing and it's just not enrolled in a program, and that wouldn't be captured because there's really no way of capturing that. So our protected, you know, status is just people who are enrolled into those longer term programs, permanently protected lands like state and federal lands, you know, water, that sort of stuff. So anybody who's not enrolled into any of those programs don't quite fit. So, you know, this thermometer here, it might say we're at 40%, but if you take into account all the people who aren't planning on doing anything with their forest land as far as development or anything like that, we already may be well past that 60%. It's just we don't have a real good way of portraying that without, you know, having those landowners enrolled. Other programs that would be beneficial is the tax class 2C, which is managed forest land program. It's basically a tax reduction program going from 1% tax on rural vacant land to 0.65%. Basically, just an incentive for them to have a forest stewardship plan, to have, you know, proper management activities kind of laid out for them and for them to be able to follow if they want. That's not a long-term program. It's re-enrolled on an annual basis, so it doesn't quite fall under the protection scheme of things, just because somebody could go in one year and be out again the next. So not quite falling into that protection category. Now I'll talk about the grant that we had at the Crow Wing SWCD, kind of based around this whole landscape stewardship plan and Camp Ripley. As you can see, it has a pretty similar boundary to the landscape stewardship plan, this has 6 out of those 7 subwatersheds, so it's just missing the one on the far southeast. But the main intent of this grant was to get 70 stewardship or 50 stewardship plans and 25 cost share contracts for best management practices. And as of our last update, we had 76 completed stewardship plans for just over 13,000 acres and 33 cost share contracts for just over 400 acres. So there you can see that 3, and then there's a 10-mile buffer around Camp Ripley as well. The red one is kind of their high priority. The blue line is kind of their secondary priority around the camp. So it's easy to see that, you know, the majority of that landscape area is within that 10-mile buffer. And one thing I'll note too is with how wildly successful this grant seemed to be, we decided to go for a phase 2, which should be getting approved this legislative session. And a big part of that one is we're partnering now with the Nature Conservancy as well as Great River Greening, which is a company just north of the cities. But the Nature Conservancy will be doing a lot of prescribed burning on private forested land. So we'll actually have kind of, you know, we'll probably be the ones to help find the projects, and then TNC will be the one to kind of come through and do, you know, site prep if need be, you know, the burning afterwards, and then we would likely do a follow-up inspection after that. This is just an example of some of the BMPs we funded. I guess I put on that last slide, we had 33 different options for people to do BMPs. Really covers the whole gamut of everything management. You could do timber stand improvement, you could do brush management, conservation cover, you know, forest trails and landings. I mean, you name it, you could tie it to one of those BMPs. So there's lots of options for folks. The picture on the left is an oak release that was done kind of over by Staples. If you look in the background of that picture, you can see how shady and dense and just kind of not good it is back there, especially from a fire standpoint. You know, there's lots of fuels in there. And now you can see with it being a lot more opened up around a lot of those better quality oaks, that there's a lot more sunlight coming through the forest floor. You know, a big problem with this site was lack of oak regeneration, and that's largely in part due to the lack of sunlight hitting the forest floor. So opening that up, this is about a year after the thinning was done. So you can already see there's a lot of vegetation starting to grow up. And then, like I said before, prescribed burning on the right, obviously going through some pines, trying to hit some of that regeneration and fuel reduction as well.
Hi, Clayton, if you could just be wrapping it up, that would be great.
Sure, yeah, I'll try to go a little faster, sorry. So all of these things, you know, water quality, nutrients, erosion, habitat, wildlife, it can all be kind of brought down to active forest management. These are just a list of the partners. I just want to touch on the National Wild Turkey Federation. You know, our Save the Habitat, Save the Hunt, it's our 10-year initiative that we have going on right now. Started in 2012 to conserve or enhance 4 million acres. We exceeded that. Recruit 1.5 million hunters. We exceeded that. And open up 500,000 additional acres for hunting. And we exceeded that as well, with still a year and a half to go. And one good thing, more than one good thing, but a really good thing about the NWTF is 89 cents out of every dollar that we get from fundraising events or anything like that goes to on-the-ground implementation. And something a lot of folks don't know is that NWTF is actually the 4th largest purchaser of timber in the U.S. And that varies from, you know, Forest Service properties to, you know, state, wherever we can help out, do that sort of stuff. So just kind of more stuff on NWTF. You know, we do more than just turkey stuff. It's what's in our name, but we do a lot more than that. Like I said, everything can be tied to active forest management. So water quality, habitat, fuels reduction, all that sort of stuff, you know, is all things that we do. It's not just turkeys, even though we do a lot of turkey stuff too. We also have a lot of youth programs, our JAKES, stands for Juniors Acquiring Knowledge, Ethics, and Sportsmanship. Hunting heritage, we do disabled veterans hunts, all that sort of stuff. And then just to wrap things up, what can SWCDs do to help promote not just fire management, but just active management in general on private lands, working with landowners to address their interests, whether they're into wildlife and are a hunter, or they're more about water quality, or just like bird watching, or they're worried about taxes, or timber is their main focus. You can kind of hit all of those different things with forest management in one regard or another. So it's, finding what their interests are and tying it to our objectives are the easiest thing that we can do to get our foot in the door. Promoting forest stewardship plans, like I said, getting those proper management objectives out there to the landowner and kind of a timeline so they know, you shouldn't clear cut the whole forest at once type of thing. Increasing the protection of our forest lands, programs like SFIA, really crucial to the water quality and long-term conservation of our forest lands in Minnesota. Same with conservation easements and those types of things. And increasing on-the-ground implementation. Like I said, we had an LCCMAR grant, which is from the state, usually largely funded by the state lottery proceeds. But there's kind of a magnitude of different opportunities in Minnesota to get funding for conservation work, and especially work that ties to water quality. So, just being aware of those options is going to be your main focus. So that's all I got. There's my email address if anybody has any more in-depth questions. I know I hit it pretty vaguely, but as you can see, I kind of had to crunch it into time. So if anybody has any questions, just let me know. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have some good questions in the chat, and Ann's going to be handling them after we get through the rest of this session. So I'd like to move on to our next speaker. And we have Benoit. He's the environmental director from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And we're really pleased to have tribal representation here. NACD does a lot of work with our tribes. It has a great tribal RPG. And so we're going to hand it right over to Ben. He's going to be talking about cross-boundary landscapes, coordinating projects with tribes in the Northeast. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you see my screen here?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So yeah, I got a lot of slides, so let's get right into it. Good morning, everyone. My name is Benoit. I'm the environmental director here at Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. So we're located just north of where Clayton was talking about. Crow Wing County is the county just south of Cass County, which is kind of the southern part of the Leech Lake Indian Reservation. So kind of an overview of what we'll talk about here. So who am I? Who's the Leech Lake Band? What are the band's priorities? How are we implementing them with federal, state, local agencies? And then kind of where do you guys fit in? So that's the quick presentation that I prepared. So who are we? So, well, I'm a tribal citizen. I also serve as our environmental director. I have my hands in a lot of different activities the tribe oversees, particularly because I'm the named point of contact for our memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Forest Service. So I deal with a lot of different issues, a lot of different projects. But our government, and I'm part of our government in two ways. One, I'm a citizen of Leech Lake Nation. Two, I'm an employee here. So our reservation here is broken into three districts, and we have 5 elected leaders. We have our chairman, Farron Jackson. We have a secretary treasurer, who's Arthur LaRose, and those 2 positions are voted on reservation wide. So it doesn't matter where you live on the reservation, you get a say in those two elected positions. Then on the map here, you can see we have 3 different districts. So District 1, District 2, and District 3. I live up on District 1 on the north side of the reservation. Our representative is Robbie Howe. District 2 kind of is the southeast portion, east side of Leech Lake, south side of Winnibigoshish Lake, and Steve White is the representative there. And then District 3 is kind of the western side of the reservation. Leroy Staples Fairbanks is the elected representative there. And that really makes up our government. And then we have a bunch of divisions underneath, that oversee health and human services, resource management, where I work, education. You know, we have a school. There's so really it's set up like a lot of other different governments. So the unique thing about Leech Lake Reservation is that we share a lot of boundary with the Chippewa National Forest. So back in the early 1900s, when the federal government broke up the Leech Lake ownership of the whole reservation and opened it up to non-Indian settlement, there was a lot of you know, clashing with Indians and non-Indians about forestry, timber harvest, you know, crime, you know. Anyway, the federal government ultimately decided to create a national forest out of the surplus lands there. So today, about 90% of the Leech Lake Indian Reservation overlaps with Forest Service, or you know, is managed by the Forest Service for the betterment of the band. So the Chippewa National Forest extends beyond the Leech Lake Reservation in a lot of different ways, but a lot of the reservation falls within the Forest Service boundaries. So, and that's kind of what we'll be talking about today, what the brand's priorities are related to it, how we've been implementing them with the Forest Service, what are some of the projects we're doing, and how other people fit into that. So Leech Lake's a pretty rural area. Here you can see, you know, the reservation. This is Crow Wing County, which Clayton was just talking about. Here's Cass County, Itasca County, Beltrami County, and Hubbard County. And there's two large cities, Grand Rapids and Bemidji. They both have large mills. So Blandon Paper Mill is in Grand Rapids. Potlatch Delta is in Bemidji, and they both overlap within the Leech Lake Reservation. There's a 50-mile circles drawn around those cities, and so you can see that, you know, there's a big timber interest where the overlap is the Leech Lake Indian Reservation. So really a lot of pressure on the Forest Service to put wood up, and the band doesn't receive any of the proceeds from the timber sales or anything like that. So really, a lot of our band members see a negative impact of timber, you know, kind of a loss of tribal gathering areas, you know, a lot of the swamps dry up when you harvest close. So there's been a real concentrated effort recently to try to do things in ways that aren't negatively affecting our people. So that's kind of how this whole thing started. You know, we sent a letter to the Forest Service talking about these timber related concerns. The Forest Service came back and said, well, let's solve these problems. You know, they have a trust obligation to the band. What are the vegetative priorities of the Leech Lake band? How do we get to a shared decision type area where decisions are benefiting both, you know, the general public that the U.S. Forest Service has an obligation to manage for, but also the band, which the U.S. Forest Service has an obligation to benefit for. So that was kind of the impetus for a lot of this work. So what's a healthy forest? You know, it kind of depends on who you talk to. If you talk to someone over at Blandon, they tell you, oh, it's a forest that's recycling itself, where the trees are healthy and growing straight and tall. But if you talk to some of the tribal members, they'd say, oh, no, it's a place where we can find the flora and fauna that we need to sustain ourselves as people, you know, that we can tell, we can go to different stands and share our stories that we have, you know, as tribal members, that we can see the natural cycles that, you know, are there with fire, with forest regenerating, which you kind of lose when you do timber management. So it really depends on who you talk to. Ultimately, what the band did is we came up with desired vegetative conditions, things that, you know, we spoke with our community members, we spoke with our elders, our leaders, and came up with these broad goals on how we can manage the forest kind of as a big block, as a landscape, rather than just individual parcels. We looked at the best available science, you know, a lot of ecological focus. Within the Chippewa National Forest, there's the Northern Research Station, which does a lot of work, you know, that we based a lot of these things on. So what are they? They fall into three categories. There's cultural ones, you know, protecting the cultural integrity. Threatened endangered species, tribal cultural properties is the second one. So, you know, the reservation is unique in that a lot of our ability to gather and hunt is tied to this particular area. So if you lose a species, say, you know, eagles leave, like, as a people, we can't pick our reservation up and move it, you know, and follow where the eagles go or follow where different things go. You know, we're kind of locked in where we're at. So managing for things being here is more important to us. Then there's these ecological blocks. So Ecologically functioning old growth. When you're turning over a forest for timber a lot, your forest stays perpetually young. So that's a problem here that we see on Leech Lake Reservation, not a lot of old growth. Maintaining and protecting diverse hardwood stands. So a lot of the management has tended towards monocultural aspen. The Aspen Initiative, so aspen kind of grows like a weed, you know. How do you reduce that and promote some of the diversity that I think is important as you talk about things like climate change? How do you restore conifers to these ecological functioning systems rather than the plantations that a lot of the forest resembles today? And then environmental justice. So if a decision's made, you know, it's got to follow the decision. The scenic corridors, you know, there's large roads that a lot of people travel. We don't want to see cutting right up next to them. You know, we want our forest to reflect who we are as people. So cultural DVCs, this is kind of what I went through, you know. The management should be trying to achieve a goal rather than a goal in and of itself. And that way it's easier to explain to people, you know, kind of what the end game is, what you're getting at. Increasing blocks of ecological functioning old growth. So with the Forest Service, we identified areas on the forest where we could look at where there's old trees. You know, they might not be functioning old growth in an ecological sense, but it's something you can build off of and work to. Restoring conifers to ecological functioning systems. So when you have plantations, if you don't thin them early enough, what happens is you end up with these kind of Q-tip looking pine trees. Nothing really grows underneath them in terms of berries. You got a lot of hazel, but not really a great resource for people or for fauna, and you're losing that shrub layer that a lot of people are looking for. Maintaining and protecting diverse hardwood stands. You know, a lot of our people are looking for sugar maple stands to go harvest sugar maple out of to make their sugar bushes at. How do you protect what's left? You know, how do you protect you know, worms from inhabiting these things? You know, recognizing that there is a cultural tie to these areas. The Aspen Initiative, you know, like I said, it grows like a weed. Really hard to convert out once you have it established. But when you think of climate change and what that means, you know, aspen's a species that's not supposed to thrive in the upcoming climate. So how do you be proactive on that? And then protection of these scenic corridors. You know, here's a map, kind of all the scenic areas of the Leech Lake Reservation. So Congress passed this bill called the Tribal Forest Protection Act in 2004, and it really gives the Forest Service some authorities to implement some of the things. So utilizing this mechanism, the band has been working with the Forest Service to try to change some of the policy, to be proactive on implementing the tribal's vegetative conditions on the front end rather than on the back end. So some of the TFPA projects to date are this red pine white spruce thinning, kind of going in early, cutting aggressively to open up that canopy and allow some of the different diversity into these plantation type stands. Snowshoe hare, which we'll get into a little bit, an aspen, Tribal Forest Protection Act, trying to restore some of the natural forest ecology as it relates to fire. And we're looking ahead, you know, some white cedar, maple basswood, regenning conifer. So you can't really see it here unless you look hard, but center of the screen, there's your snowshoe hare. So what do they like? What do they like for habitat? Well, they like, you know, coarse woody debris. It gives them places to hide. And what we've found here at Leech Lake is that when you're really aggressive in terms of prevention, you know, one of the things is to remove all coarse woody debris from stands. Managing for plantations, having them after a timber sale, having them knock all that stuff down and put it on the ground really has a secondary effect of diminishing the snowshoe hare habitat. So what we've seen is that, you know, in these core areas where there's not really a lot of logging, like say a cedar swamp, you find a lot of areas for snowshoe hare to hide. When you venture outside of these areas, you run into a lot less areas. And what it's done is it's constricted our hare populations to just these like core areas. So what the snowshoe hare TFPA is looking to do is to increase your secondary habitat areas, connect some of these high quality core habitats so you can see the population peaks and valleys like historically would have happened, which we haven't seen since the 70s. So the pine TFPA spruce kind of looks at all these 20 to 40-year-old stands, pine, red pine and white spruce stands, which need to be thinned early if you want to open up the canopy and prevent some of that Q-tipping, like I talked about earlier. So we picked this area where there's a lot of these stands in an area, and we're working with the Forest Service to create a project focused just on that effort, you know, to get in there, thin early, thin often, create some diversity in these stands moving forward. So some of the scope and scale, you know, we started pretty small on these projects, you know, one area as a pilot, but now they're really growing, and we're looking at whole sections of the forest to move on to. TFPA fire restoration. So we submitted a TFPA Fire Restoration Act, or under the Tribal Forest Protection Act back in 2009. We're starting to look at that now, developing some pilot project areas that we can look to implement large scale later. And some of our lessons learned. So what you really need is you need strong support from both sides. You need to find those champions who can establish good working relationships, trust each other, and follow through on actions. Starting small, but then thinking big, you know, like starting with a small project, seeing how it works, and then, you know, thinking with your champions on how to incorporate these into broader approaches. TFPA allows tribes to think outside of the box. So, you know, there's a marriage between this traditional ecological knowledge that is held by the communities who have lived there, you know, forever, into some of the more modern forestry practices. So it's kind of a marriage between modern day science and traditional ecological knowledge, which actually marries pretty well. Some of the outcomes have really been strong relationships, some better management practices, and the potential to create large scale projects. Some of our next steps are trying to work these desired vegetative conditions into the state, the counties. We're doing some reserve treaty rights lands funding opportunities. So we were awarded over $10 million to do brush work really on you know, our stands, but Minnesota DNR, county lands, Forest Service stands, all within the Leech Lake Reservation, with the focus being ecological restoration and readying for prescribed burning. So that's kind of the work we've got going on. For you guys, you know, I would just recommend get in contact with the tribes who may be around you, see what their priorities are, see where you fit in. You know, we're pretty busy on the tribal side, but you know, establishing communication and building relationships is really what all this work is founded on and is about. So thanks for the time today. The next speaker is Carl Honkin from the U.S. Forest Service. So I'll turn it right over to Carl, and we can continue on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ben. That was great. I think it's really important, the work that you're doing, and really focusing on that heritage. And thank you. Carl is our next speaker. Carl Hunkerton is with the U.S. Forest Service in the East region. I have the opportunity to work with Carl, and I think we're in for a treat listening to him. Thanks, Carl, and we'll let you take it away.
Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes, we're all set.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to keep my excuse me, video off because I have bandwidth issues, so apologize for that. Working here in Maine, sometimes you got to get the squirrel running in the can to move the electricity, so we'll do our best. So I'm Carl Honkin. I work for the U.S. Forest Service in state and private forestry in the eastern region. And our goal is to help provide leadership, technical support, some sound science, and most importantly, grants and financial assistance to help ensure that our region's forests provide clean water, forest products, wildlife habitat, recreation, and all those other great forest benefits. So what I'd like to do today, if I can advance this slide. There we go. Overview today. I'm going to talk about our landscape scale restoration grants, how they came about, and how maybe your conservation district can apply to one of these if you're unfamiliar with them. And to showcase that program, I'd like to speak about a grant program on the Merrimack River in New Hampshire and Maine. And it was involving expanding riparian forest buffers. But before I do, I just want to explain the territory that I work in. Oops. I work in the 6 New England states and New York, which is the upper northeastern corner of the 20-state region. So I like to use the letter B to explain my territory. From north to south, it goes from Bangor to Brooklyn. From east to west, it goes from Buffalo to Boston. So at all points in between. So that's the landscape that I work in. And it's important to note that this is one of the most forested landscapes in the country. So looking at this map, you'll see that the green illustrates the forest cover and the white is non-forest cover. So we have 172, give or take, acres of forest land. And about 41% of the population of the United States lives in this 20-state region. That's over 125 million people. And a lot of this is privately owned land, as we all know. And the important water statistic to consider is that approximately 50 to 75% of the region's population here relies on surface water as their municipal drinking water source. And that comes from a variety of community water systems. So why is water important? Well, we started off in the early in the 19th century, clearing a lot of forest land. And that forest land clearing created a lot of problems. We cleared a lot of forests to support agricultural industries, which continued into the 20th century. So in the last 50 or so years of the 19th century, we lost forest cover from 70% to less than 20% in many areas east of the Mississippi River. And that translated to about 13 square miles a day. And a lot of this land was on highly erosive, steep slopes, which factored into the formation of the Forest Service via the Weeks Act. Senator Weeks was concerned about erosion issues actually in New Hampshire and began an effort to form the Forest Service. So I want to use New Hampshire for a second as an example. And so the Forest Service's state and private forestry program has a landscape scale restoration grants program. And what this does is it helps state forest agencies achieve the priorities that they document in their state forest action plans. Now, these action plans are a requirement of the Farm Bill, and they're updated just last year. So the goal of these action plans in New Hampshire, one of the goals was to protect high quality watersheds, shorelines, and riparian areas. So a takeaway for all of you is the fact that every state has a state forest action plan, again, a requirement of the Farm Bill. Really get to know that action plan and its objectives, because that's the ticket to getting landscape scale restoration grants, as well as moving all of these objectives forward. We issue approximately $4 million a year in landscape scale restoration grants. In my experience, several conservation districts in the Northeast have received these grants. They do require a 1-to-1 non-federal match. They run upwards of a maximum of $600,000 for multi-state projects, and they usually last around 3 years. We release the RFP for these grants every summer, and the applications are due usually in mid-September. So the Merrimack is kind of a poster child that I'd like to talk about next. So why am I choosing the Merrimack River to talk about? Well, it's flooded many times, and we have to be concerned with that, obviously. But another really founding study came out in 2014. The Forest Service conducted an analysis called Forests, Water, and People. And that 2014 analysis ranked the Merrimack River watershed as the most threatened in the country due to the rapid development of private forest lands. So protecting these forest lands is essential to preserving their natural filtration function for water quality. These forests and trees obviously remove pathogens and other pollutants, helping keep the river's water clean. So what you see in this map is a composite score of a variety of watershed-based factors, which we call the ability to produce clean water. So the watersheds that are at risk for future conversion, the orange watersheds would be low risk of conversion. The blue watersheds of being high risk of conversion from forest land to other non-forest uses. So 3 of the top 4 watersheds in the country in this study projected to experience the most change were on private forest lands in New Hampshire, so hence the need for action. New Hampshire does rely on surface water in providing water supply for its residents. The loss of forests threatens the drinking water of more than 600,000 people, including the Massachusetts communities Lowell, Lawrence, Methuen, Tewksbury, and Andover, Mass, and the New Hampshire city of Nashua. All of these towns rely on surface water withdrawals for their water supplies. And to add more convincing statements to this argument is the fact that American Rivers, a well-known river advocacy group, named the Merrimack as one of the most endangered rivers in 2016. And again, due to the rapid loss of forests and trees within the watershed. So what are we going to do about it? We don't want to see this happen if we can avoid it in watershed lands in and around the Merrimack where appropriate. So we need to prioritize smart land use planning, green infrastructure, and accelerate land protection in order to protect the Merrimack and clean its water supplies. So to do that, this grant-funded project was awarded in 2014 on expanding riparian forest buffers in threatened urban and suburban watersheds of New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The Merrimack River Watershed Council received a landscape scale restoration grant, which developed a precision stormwater approach to restoring riparian buffers. So let me give you that quick tutorial on buffers. So why do we care about buffers? Well, it's essentially where the water intersects the land. So it's that buffer area, roughly around 100 feet wide on either side, where the forests can help filter runoff into our local streams, rivers, lakes, etc. Some might describe this as a floodplain, and it's not always well defined. The buffer is usually on a stream in this grant case, and it averages about 100 feet wide, and it's either grass or trees. And we want to manage them to protect the integrity of stream channels and reduce the impacts of upstream land uses. So the goal of this particular grant was to target hydrologic unit code, or HUC 12, watersheds in the Merrimack in New Hampshire and Mass, where reforestation of riparian buffers will greatly improve water quality and species diversity. The major deliverables of this grant are listed here. And basically they started off doing a landscape scale GIS analysis, which identified the most important suburban watersheds adjacent to the Merrimack River. Once they prioritized those watersheds, they worked with the surrounding towns to increase well-managed forest buffers. They trained private foresters and municipal officials in forest practices that help protect buffers. And then we also worked with state agencies to identify existing and potential new brownfields in these buffer areas to coordinate voluntary tree plantings to restore those buffers. So here you'll see a GIS map which depicts where those locations were in each state. So again, we wanted to look at 6 sub-watersheds, 3 in each state, New Hampshire being on the top, Massachusetts on the bottom. So we considered, where do we have impervious surface less than 5% for protection, or between 6 to 7 or 8% to restore. We considered water quality concerns by consulting the 303D list. We looked at population projections based on build-out analyses. And then we also consulted each state's natural heritage database to look at rare and endangered species. So the result was these 6 watersheds, 3 in each state for implementation. We worked with the cities and towns in these 6 watersheds to help them develop some tools to manage forests around these buffers. So we met with conservation commissions in each of these towns, and we presented some buffer bylaw options to each of these conservation commissions that they could consider in helping to preserve, protect, and enhance riparian buffers through municipal bylaws. And here's an example of some of the handouts that we did for each of those communities. We also trained a variety of private foresters and municipal officials in buffer protection and good forestry. So we did a variety of woodlot visits looking at about a little under 4,000 acres of land, looked at tree health and invasive insect issues in those riparian buffers. And then we worked with these foresters to develop forest stewardship plans in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts, looking at about 580 acres in New Hampshire and over 1,000 in New Hampshire, where forest stewardship plans within buffer locations were enacted. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. We did a variety of riparian buffer restoration plantings in these 6 sub-watersheds, some of which were on municipal land, some of which were on private land. And we worked with the cities and towns to help identify appropriate sites. For example, the one in the center was adjacent to a tributary to the Merrimack, and it was within the confines of a Department of Public Works maintenance yard. And the maintenance staff were basically using this riparian buffer to store equipment, and it was kind of their boneyard where all the junk went. And so we talked to them about cleaning up all that junk and then replanting it with appropriate native riparian buffer species. And that was a very much of a win-win. So then we wanted to look at future sites. Where are some other sites within these watersheds where we have, in some cases, agricultural impacts adjacent to the watershed, brownfield sites, overuse of some parklands. And so we didn't stop at this one-size-fits-all effort. And so we looked at potential future sites which to restore in coming years. And the result of that, I'm happy to say, is a new landscape scale restoration grant was just awarded in FY21 to the same organization, the Merrimack River Watershed Council, to help implement this project a little bit further in these threatened watersheds. So I'm going to stop there. That's a brief introduction to what we're talking about here in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts. I'll turn my video on, and if there's questions, I'm happy to help. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Carl. I'm going to turn it over to Ann to, she's going to direct the Q&A, but I just wanted to add that in the Northeast and the work we're doing on source water protection and public drinking water supply, how important this is. And as it relates to fire management, when we're looking at these impaired watersheds, it's not just about the quantity of water, quality of water, it's about the quantity of water. And there's some real challenges in the Northeast where considered water rich, but with climate change, changes in temperature, change in precipitation, and the way that the precipitation is falling, we're seeing that we're having more periods of drought. As a matter of fact, I know parts of Connecticut right now, we're looking at possibly putting in some moderate drought restrictions because we've got a drought going on down here right now. So, and it may not be dry like what they experience out in the Southwest, but with our vegetation's really suffering. So I just want to put out how important that work is from a water quantity perspective. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, that sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and work through the questions on the chat, and thank you to all the speakers. Thank you so much, Denise, for moderating. And I absolutely have enjoyed every one of them, and I have several comments and such in the chat. The most recent question was from Leanne, and that to you, Carl, is who identifies the area as threatened?
Well, in this case, in the Merrimack watershed, we did a complete GIS analysis. So the grantee worked with existing data from each state to develop that synthesis of watersheds which would be prioritized for riparian buffer restoration. And then we worked with the cooperative extension offices in New Hampshire to help deliver public messages to get that word out. So it was accessing state and federal data like the 303D list to develop those priorities.
Very good. Thank you so much. Kind of on the lines of that, the priorities and projects and such, I'm going to go ahead and bump back to Clayton, and if he is still on here, yes, Clayton. So how did the Camp Ripley surface to being that project? I know, Lindbergh, thank you so much for your comment in the chat, you know, that it took a lot of coffee, I think, but, and you may want to chime in on this, because I do think it's really critical that determination of where the project is really is based on local interest, and it takes a lot of energy over time. Can you speak a little bit to how that project with the Camp Ripley really became a priority?
I'll let Lindbergh take that, because the project was kind of already in the works by the time I started there, so he would probably have a little more backstory to it.
Sure. Thank you, Clayton. And Anne, in terms of that history, I think Department of Defense and Camp Ripley really was a driving force in protecting those operations.
All right. I appreciate that.
And to build on it, this is Leanne from Minnesota. I remember going to an NACD event years ago where each military base is looking for this across the country. So what we did then is utilize an existing easement program that our state had, and again, complementing federal dollars with an easement program that runs through the districts. So it was a really win-win. We had a federal opportunity, federal funding, and our state agency, our soil conservation agency, not our forestry agency, but our soil conservation agency, could utilize an existing easement program that our soil and water districts have access and deliver locally. So it's making sure that you got priorities and programs in place that can leverage each other.
That's a good background. Thank you so much, Leanne. And next question, next comment, thank you, Lauren. I think SFIA is an excellent program, but have a hard time convincing landowners to sign up for 8, 20, or 50 years, because in many cases their kids are inheriting the land and they can't promise areas won't be built on. So how do you present SFIA to landowners that encourages them to make the commitment? And were all of those stewardship plans paid for by landowners, or do you provide those for free, or do NRCS funds to write them? Clayton, I think, are others that want to add or respond to that question? Could you please go ahead and do that in the chat? And we need to move into our final panel, but thank you again for all the comments and questions. I apologize if I've missed any. I think I caught them all, but that one is really much more in detail with SFIA and the questions. And I think they're great questions, Lauren. So thank you so much. And Lindbergh, thank you for adding in your comments.